Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, today I want to speak to your hearts, to the deep places within you where doubt, fear, and confusion may sometimes linger. I want to remind you of a truth that might seem paradoxical in the moment, but a truth that will carry you through every storm and every season of isolation in your life. That truth is this: don't worry. God isolates you for a reason. Do not despair. You see, when we face times of solitude, when we find ourselves standing alone in what seems like a vast and empty world, we are often tempted to believe that we are forsaken, that we are abandoned, or that we have been forgotten. But my dear friends, it is in these very moments that God is working. It is in these moments of isolation that God is preparing you, refining you, and setting you up for a destiny far greater than anything you can imagine. Isolation is a place of preparation. Isolation is not a punishment, it is a divine preparation. So often, we are tempted to view periods of solitude or separation from others as a curse, but in reality, they are the very environments in which our deepest growth occurs. Think about a sculptor standing before a raw block of marble. The artist doesn't simply start chiseling away randomly. Each strike, each cut, each precise removal of stone is intentional. It reveals the masterpiece hidden within the stone. Similarly, God uses seasons of isolation to refine you, shaping you into the person you are destined to become. Consider the story of Moses. He spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, far removed from the comforts of his life in Egypt. For Moses, this was a time of preparation, although he may have never imagined it at the time. While in the desert, God was preparing Moses to lead an entire nation. The wilderness shaped him into the leader who would later confront Pharaoh and lead Israel to freedom. It was in that wilderness, far from the comforts of his past, that Moses discovered who he truly was and began to hear God's voice more clearly. Now, I know this might be difficult to grasp. When we feel isolated, it feels like we are stuck, like life is passing us by. But think about how nature works. Before a seed can sprout into a mighty tree, it must first be buried in the ground, away from the world's view. It must go through the dark and silent process of growth beneath the surface before it can rise and shine. You too may be in a season of burial, where your efforts seem unseen, where your progress feels slow. But in reality, God is preparing you for something powerful. Your isolation is the soil in which your purpose is being cultivated. When it's time, you will rise above, stronger and more refined than you ever thought possible. This principle is seen in the lives of so many figures of faith and purpose. Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers and cast into a prison, spent years alone and forgotten. Yet in those years, God was refining Joseph's character, preparing him to stand before kings. His isolation was the crucible where his dreams were shaped into a powerful reality. Joseph had to be broken, reshaped, and tested before he could fulfill the calling on his life. Likewise, your season of isolation may feel overwhelming, but it is the very place where God is forming you into something greater. The process might be uncomfortable, but the result will be worth it. Isolation strengthens your relationship with God. It's in times of isolation that our relationship with God deepens. When everything around us is stripped away, when we are left with nothing but ourselves and our Creator, we are faced with a powerful opportunity. It is during these moments of solitude that we learn to rely on God in ways we never could if we were surrounded by distractions and the noise of the world. Think about Jesus. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, alone, hungry and tempted. He wasn't surrounded by a crowd of followers. He wasn't with friends. He wasn't even with family. It was just him and God. In that time of isolation, Jesus was able to focus solely on his Father's will. He was tested in ways that revealed his reliance on God alone. Jesus' time in the wilderness was not a time of weakness. It was a time of empowerment. He came out of that desert stronger, clearer in his purpose, and fully equipped for the mission ahead. Isolation has a way of forcing us to face the raw truth of who we are. Without distractions, we are confronted with our own thoughts, fears, and desires. This can be a difficult and uncomfortable process, but it is also where we begin to see God's grace in action. When there is no one else to lean on, we discover how deeply we can depend on God. Just like a tree with deep roots can withstand the harshest storms, so too does a person who is rooted in God's presence. You may not feel strong now, but in your solitude, God is teaching you to stand firm in your faith. Furthermore, God uses isolation to sharpen our sensitivity to his voice. When the world is silent, when there are no other voices competing for our attention, we can hear God more clearly. We begin to sense his presence in a deeper way, feeling his peace in the midst of our struggles. You see, God doesn't always speak in the loud moments of life. He often whispers in the quiet, in the stillness of our hearts. The isolation you are experiencing may be God's invitation to draw near to him, to hear his voice in ways that the busyness of life would not allow. This is something that can be difficult to understand when you're in the midst of it. During times of isolation, we often question whether God is even there. But I want to encourage you, God is never closer than when you are isolated. It is in these times that he is refining you, preparing you to hear his voice with greater clarity and to step into the next chapter of your life with unwavering faith. Look at the Apostle Paul. After his dramatic conversion, Paul spent years in the desert before beginning his ministry. Those years were not wasted. They were years of intense personal development and learning. Paul did not have the luxury of the crowds or the affirmation of others. In his isolation, God revealed the deep truths that would shape the early church. He learned to trust in God's wisdom and timing rather than relying on human validation. Through his solitude, Paul became one of the most impactful figures in the history of the Christian faith. In the same way, your time in isolation is not for nothing. It is a season to draw closer to God, to deepen your relationship with him, and to prepare your heart for the journey ahead. So when you feel alone, when you feel like no one understands what you are going through, know that you are not abandoned. God is right there with you, refining you, shaping you, and making you more like him. You are not isolated by accident. You are in the perfect place to experience a deeper connection with your Creator. And in that relationship, you will find strength, clarity, and peace to move forward with confidence. Isolation teaches you to trust God's timing. In a world that thrives on instant gratification, waiting can feel like a punishment. The pressure to succeed now, to have everything figured out today, weighs heavily on many of us. But here's a truth you must understand. God's timing is not our timing. It's not about how quickly you can reach your goal or fulfill your dream. It's about God's perfect plan for your life unfolding at the right moment, in the right way. God's timing is not God's own perfect plan for your life, unfolding at the right moment, in the right way. David's story offers a powerful example of this. As a young boy, David was anointed to be king of Israel. God's promise was clear. David would rise to a position of great authority. But instead of being crowned king immediately, David spent years in hiding, fleeing from King Saul, the very person he was supposed to replace. He was isolated, alone, and hunted. Yet in this period of waiting, God was teaching David patience, trust, and the importance of his perfect timing. David's life during this time was not one of idleness. It was a season of deep personal and spiritual growth. The wilderness and the caves where David sought refuge were places where he learned to lean on God fully. He discovered that God's provision was not limited to palaces or comfort. It was present in the deserts and in moments of extreme isolation. David's faith grew stronger, and his dependence on God became unshakable. What seemed like a delay in his promise was actually a preparation for the weight of the kingship that would one day rest on his shoulders. Your season of waiting may feel long, even unbearable at times. You may be wondering why your breakthrough has not come yet, why your prayers haven't been answered, or why your dreams remain distant. But just like David, you are in a season of refinement. God is aligning the circumstances and people around you, preparing you for the role He has planned for you. If David had become king too early, he might not have been ready to lead. The same is true for you. God is allowing you to grow, to mature, and to strengthen your faith so that when the time is right, you will be fully prepared to step into your destiny. God's timing might not make sense in the moment, but trust that He is never late. His delays are not denials. The things you think you need right now may be the very things you are not yet ready to handle. God, in His infinite wisdom, is allowing you to grow in the waiting, strengthening your foundation so that you can stand firm when your time comes. Remember, a house built too quickly with weak foundations will eventually collapse. But one that is built with care, patience, and precision will withstand the storms. Trust God's timing. He is not withholding something good from you. He is preparing you for something great. Isolation reveals your true self. When we are surrounded by the noise of the world, by the demands of others, the pressures to perform, and the expectations placed upon us, it is easy to lose sight of who we truly are. We live in a society that values outward appearances, success, and approval. But we often base our worth on what others think, and we try to live up to the image we believe others expect of us. But isolation has a way of stripping all that away, leaving you with nothing but your true self, your real desires, and your authentic identity. Think about the process of refining gold. The metal is placed in a furnace, and the heat burns away the impurities. The gold does not look the same after it's been purified. It's being tested, cleansed, and refined. Similarly, isolation tests us. It burns away the distractions, the insecurities, and the false identities we have created for ourselves. In those quiet, lonely moments, we are forced to confront who we really are. And often we discover that we are far more capable, strong, and resilient than we thought. Take, for example, the story of Elijah. After confronting the prophets of Baal and witnessing God's power in a dramatic showdown, Elijah found himself running for his life, fleeing from Queen Jezebel's threats. He retreated into the wilderness, feeling utterly alone, discouraged, and defeated. Yet it was in the isolation of the wilderness that Elijah had a profound encounter with God. He was no longer surrounded by crowds or the noise of battle. He was alone with his thoughts, his doubts, and his fears. And it was in that solitude that God spoke to him in a still, small voice. God didn't come in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. He came in the quiet. Elijah, in his isolation, was given the opportunity to rediscover his purpose, his identity, and his calling. He was reminded that he was not alone in his struggles. God was with him, shaping him and revealing his true nature. Isolation revealed to Elijah not just the depth of his own fears, but the depth of God's faithfulness. Isolation has a similar effect on us. It reveals the parts of ourselves that we may have been hiding or ignoring. It shows us where we are strong and where we need growth. In these moments of solitude, we begin to see clearly who we are without the masks we wear for others. And in that revelation, God can begin to heal, restore, and empower us to walk confidently in our true identity. The Apostle Paul provides another example. Before his conversion, Paul's life was centered around religious zeal and a pursuit of approval from others. He was a persecutor of Christians, convinced that he was on the right path. But when he encountered Christ on the road to Damascus, everything changed. Paul spent years in isolation in the deserts of Arabia, where he had to face the truth about his past, his motives, and his purpose. It was in this time of solitude that Paul was transformed. His former identity as a Pharisee, striving for status and power, was replaced by a new identity as a servant of Christ, dedicated to spreading the gospel. In the same way, isolation reveals not just our weaknesses, but our potential. It is a time to shed the old versions of ourselves and step into the fullness of who God created us to be. You might feel alone, but in reality, this time is an opportunity for you to get in touch with your true self, your real desires, your deepest purpose, and your connection to God. When you come out of this season of isolation, you won't just emerge with new skills or knowledge. You'll emerge with a deeper understanding of your own identity and the strength to live it out boldly. Isolation can often feel like the end of the road. When we find ourselves separated from others, cut off from the world we once knew, it's easy to believe that this is the final chapter in our story. We feel abandoned, forgotten, and unsure of how to move forward. But what if I told you that isolation is not the end, but rather the beginning of something extraordinary? Consider the caterpillar. Before it can transform into the beautiful butterfly it is destined to become, it must first spend time in the cocoon. This process of isolation is necessary for its transformation. The caterpillar is not merely waiting in the cocoon, it is undergoing a deep internal change. The cocoon is a place of protection and preservation where the caterpillar's body is restructured. The old becomes new. What once crawled along the ground will soon soar through the sky. The time spent isolated in the cocoon is not wasted. It is part of the transformation process. The same is true for you. Your season of isolation is not a period of punishment or purposelessness. It is a time of transformation. The person you are today is not the person you will be when you emerge from this time. Just like the caterpillar, you are being changed, shaped, and prepared for something greater. The isolation you are facing is not an obstacle. It is a part of your growth and renewal. Take a moment to reflect on the lives of some of the most impactful people in history. Many of them spent significant periods in isolation before they stepped into their greatness. Think of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison. During those long, isolated years, he was not just enduring suffering, he was being shaped for a larger purpose. He emerged from prison not broken, but stronger, wiser, and ready to lead a nation toward reconciliation and freedom. His time in isolation was the crucible in which his character and vision were refined. Without that time in solitude, he would not have had the strength or the perspective to fulfill the role he was called to. Isolation often reveals new opportunities. When we are isolated, we are forced to think in different ways, to consider new possibilities, and to reinvent ourselves. It is a time when God can show us what we are truly capable of. Think of an artist who works in solitude, pouring their heart and soul into a piece of work. The artist is not aimlessly wasting time. They are creating something beautiful. In the same way, God is using this time to create something new in you. Your current circumstances may feel limiting, but they are actually pushing you toward new possibilities. Isolation is not about retreating into despair. It's about retreating into a space where God can work within you. It's about allowing Him to strip away the old and prepare you for the new. The things you thought were important, the things you thought you needed, are being redefined in this time. The relationships, habits, and circumstances that once defined you are being reshaped so that when you emerge, you will be more in alignment with the person God has called you to be. Look at the example of Jesus. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness alone, fasting and praying. This time of isolation was not the end of his mission. It was the foundation for everything he would accomplish. It was in the wilderness that he resisted temptation, refined his purpose, and deepened his relationship with God. It was in that time alone that he prepared for the work that would change the world. His time of isolation wasn't just a pause. It was the very preparation needed for the incredible work ahead. Isolation serves the same purpose in your life. It is not a dead end. It is not the final chapter. It is the moment before the breakthrough, the opportunity for transformation. What feels like an obstacle is actually the place where you are being prepared for something far greater than you can see right now. The dreams, the visions, the purpose that are still inside of you are waiting for the right moment to be birthed. Your isolation is that moment of quiet, of reflection, and of change that prepares you for what's next. Think about how diamonds are formed. They don't come out of the earth shining brightly. They are created under immense pressure, heat, and time. The conditions they endure in the earth are what make them valuable. Without the isolation of the deep, dark earth, the diamond would never come into its full brilliance. In the same way, the pressure and isolation you feel are not meant to destroy you. They are the conditions that will bring out the brilliance in you. You are being prepared for a future that will shine with a beauty and strength that only comes from being refined under pressure. In this moment of isolation, God is preparing you for the next phase of your life. The isolation is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of transformation. What you are going through right now is shaping you into someone who will not only survive but thrive when the time comes. The strength you are developing, the wisdom you are gaining, the peace you are discovering, these are all part of the foundation for the work God has called you to do. So instead of viewing isolation as the end, begin to see it as the beginning. You are not being forgotten, you are being prepared. You are not being abandoned, you are being transformed. The person you are becoming is the person who will rise up and fulfill the calling on your life. The cocoon is not the end. It is the necessary process before you spread your wings and fly. This is not the final chapter. It is just the beginning of something new. The best is yet to come. As we reflect on the journey through isolation, let us remember this truth. Isolation is not the end. It is the preparation for something greater. In our solitude, we are being shaped, refined, and transformed into the people we are destined to be. It may not feel easy in the moment. It may seem like the world is passing you by. But the silence you experience is not emptiness. It is the space where God is doing His most powerful work within you. In these times, trust that God is using your isolation to strengthen you, to deepen your relationship with Him, and to teach you patience and perseverance. He is preparing you for a future that you may not yet fully understand, but it is one that is filled with purpose, greatness, and beauty. What may feel like abandonment is actually a time of divine preparation for the life you are meant to live. When you come out of this season, you will not come out the same. You will emerge stronger, more focused, and more aligned with your true calling. Just as a diamond emerges from the earth refined by pressure, you too will emerge refined, stronger, and more brilliant than before. The waiting, the isolation, and the challenges are all part of the process that will lead you to the breakthrough you have been waiting for. So, do not despair in your isolation. Do not lose hope. Understand that God is not punishing you. He is preparing you for a future filled with purpose and significance. Your isolation is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign of preparation. Trust in God's timing. Know that He is with you, working in you, and that the best is yet to come. You are not alone, and your story is far from over. It is just beginning. Stand firm, trust God, and allow this season to shape you into the person you are meant to be. Your breakthrough is coming. Keep moving forward, for the future that God has prepared for you is greater than you can imagine.